For decades, the conventional history of modern India has relied on a single, universally accepted timeline that the country's economic acceleration was birthed entirely by the liberalization, privatization, and globalization reforms of 1991. This chart maps India's real GDP growth from 1965 through the mid-1990s. Popular narratives point directly to 1991 as the sole origin of India's breakout growth. But in 2004, economists Rodrik and Subramanian ran strict econometric structural break tests on this exact data series, and they found a massive discrepancy. To understand what they found, we have to establish the baseline. From independence through 1980, the Indian economy had been trapped under the Hindu rate of growth, a stagnant, highly restrictive period where output clustered stubbornly around 3.5% per year. But the statistical data reveals that the true structural break in India's growth trajectory didn't happen in 1991. It happened here, around 1980. Across the next decade, growth accelerated by a massive 2 full percentage points, hitting a sustainable 5.5% trajectory long before a single major market reform was passed. This acceleration occurred while the government still strictly enforced industrial licensing. State-owned banks still directed politically motivated lending, and extreme tariff barriers still sealed domestic industries off from global trade. The core architecture of the socialist state was completely intact. So how exactly did an economy constrained by intense central planning engineer a massive decade-long growth acceleration without actually opening its markets? Understanding this 1980 statistical break reveals why the 1991 balance of payments crisis was the logical outcome of a specific macroeconomic trajectory. Analyzing the 1980s acceleration requires a precise distinction between pro-market and pro-business policy. This diagram models the Indian economy entering the decade. The outer wall represents extreme import tariffs protecting the entire country. The rigid internal grid represents incumbent industrial firms locked into specific production quotas by strict government licensing. A true pro-market reform tears down the protective perimeter. It lowers barriers to entry, allows foreign and domestic competitors to flood in, and forces incumbent firms to fight for their survival through raw competitive discipline. But the 1980s government chose a pro-business approach. The outer protective walls remain untouched. No foreign competition is allowed inside. Instead, the state simply dissolves the internal regulations, granting the already established incumbent firms the freedom to expand their operations and maximize profitability in a perfectly shielded environment. The primary tool for this was a policy called broadbanding. Previously, if a firm held a license to build sedans, they needed a completely separate government approval to build trucks. Broadbanding erased those narrow categories. Firms holding a license in a broad engineering sector were suddenly allowed to shift production flexibly across related product lines based on actual consumer demand. These changes were implemented entirely as reforms by stealth. The ruling Congress Party relied on organized labor and the public sector workforce for votes. To avoid ideological confrontation, they left the socialist rhetoric intact and enacted these liberalizations quietly, using administrative executive notifications rather than public legislative overhauls. When Rajiv Gandhi assumed the premiership in late 1984, this quiet administrative easing evolved into an explicit push for modernization. His government further relaxed industrial licensing and systematically eased import restrictions on the capital goods required by large industrial houses. They also planted the institutional seeds for industries that would define modern India. In 1984, the government aggressively slashed import duties on computer hardware and eased the operating conditions for software development. In parallel, the establishment of the Center for Development of Telematics drove the indigenous creation of low-cost digital telephone exchanges, specifically engineered for rural Indian conditions. This established the physical connectivity layer required for the ensuing decades of service-led growth. We can measure the success of these policies by looking at total factor productivity. This chart tracks how efficiently the economy used its capital and labor. After 15 years of near stagnation, the Phase 3 column shows a distinct upward shift. Easing restrictions allowed existing factories to utilize their idle capacity and deploy their resources efficiently. By catering to incumbents, the pro-business strategies successfully engineered an immediate supply-side expansion. But by keeping the tariff walls high, the state effectively shielded those same companies from the global competitive discipline required to build world-class, export-ready industries. Supply-side efficiencies only account for a fraction of the 1980s economic surge. To find the main engine of this acceleration, we must look at the macroeconomic balance sheet, where the state masked a severe underlying fragility. This is a macroeconomic dashboard tracking the seventh five-year plan from 1985 to 1990, 5.8%. But that growth was artificially inflated by debt-finance demand. Successive governments pumped money into the economy, driving the central fiscal deficit from roughly 6% of GDP at the start of the decade to nearly 8.5% by the end. Historically, India financed its gaps through low-interest multilateral aid. But by the mid-1980s, the state pivoted, turning increasingly to high-cost, short-term external commercial borrowing from international credit markets to sustain its domestic spending spree. This reliance on foreign credit aggressively compounded the risk. As a percentage of the total economy, external debt more than doubled, saddling the government with massive, high-interest obligations, maturing on incredibly short timelines. The government did attempt to modernize its financial architecture to manage this new environment, establishing the Securities and Exchange Board of India in 1988 to regulate the Bombay Stock Exchange, and opening minor equity avenues for public sector companies. But institutional tweaking couldn't solve the mathematical flaw at the core of the pro-business model. The heavily protected domestic manufacturers were highly profitable inside India, but their products weren't globally competitive. The country was importing massive amounts of foreign capital and technology, but its industries couldn't export enough goods to earn the necessary foreign exchange. Every month, servicing that external commercial debt rapidly drained the nation's balance of payments. Looking back at our dashboard, you can track the foreign exchange reserves plummeting steadily downward throughout the late 1980s. Any nation that accumulates foreign-denominated debt without building a mechanism to generate foreign currency is destined for a sudden stop. The underlying economic fundamentals were collapsing. The Indian state was simply waiting for a catalyst to expose the rot. That catalyst arrived amid severe domestic chaos. Following the defeat of the Congress Party in 1989, India entered a period of acute political instability, paralyzed by the Mondal Commission reservation protests and the explosive Ram Janmabhoomi movement. The National Front coalition under VP Singh collapsed within a year. The successor government survived less than 5 months. At the exact moment the macroeconomic bill came due, the Indian state lacked the stable executive authority needed to respond. Then, in August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The ensuing Gulf War triggered a sharp spike in international oil prices and instantly severed remittance inflows from Indian workers stationed in the Middle East. The math finally broke. Recognizing the severely depleted foreign exchange reserves, international credit rating agencies swiftly downgraded India's sovereign debt. Commercial credit markets completely shut India out right when emergency financing was needed most. The government was forced to compress imports violently just to keep the country running. By early 1991, foreign exchange reserves hit a critical low of roughly $1.2 billion, enough to cover barely a few weeks of essential imports. Deprived of inputs, the economy seized up. Real GDP growth collapsed from 5.8% down to a staggering 1.1%. To avoid sovereign default, the interim government took a desperate final step. They physically airlifted a portion of the country's sovereign gold reserves to banks in London and Switzerland, offering the bullion as direct collateral for emergency loans. It was a moment of profound national humiliation, but it successfully shattered the political gridlock in New Delhi. The airlift forged an immediate cross-party consensus that the old model of incremental, stealthy adjustment was dead. The transitional era of the 1980s accomplished exactly one vital task. By achieving a 5.5% growth rate, it proved that the Indian economy was capable of escaping the stagnant Hindu rate of growth. Output could accelerate if constraints were removed. The 1980s illustrate the structural limits of partial reform. Stimulating demand and easing rules for incumbent businesses created a surge in output. But leaving the protective architecture intact meant those businesses remained shielded from the global competition required to service the sovereign debt. The 1991 crisis functioned as the mathematical endpoint of the 1980s model, creating the inescapable leverage needed to force India into systemic liberalization.